tell you about a few events that we've got coming up on our calendar. Our next brown bag is going to be on September 24th. And that's going to feature research fellow Sandra Patton Imani, who hasn't arrived just yet, but she's going to be presenting on her topic, Anne Fairfax Washington Lee, Gender, Race, and Sex in 18th Century Virginia. Our next lunch at the library is going to take place on September 10, featuring Jennifer London and her new book, Profiles in Character, 16 Americans and the Traits That Define Them. And then on September 25th, we're going to be hosting our annual Founding Debates, which is an event we do every year to celebrate the anniversary of the opening of the library. And we're partnering with a group called More Perfect for this event. And we'll be exploring 5 goals of democratic renewal as we as a nation approach the 250th anniversary of the signing of our Declaration of Independence. And now to introduce today's guest speaker. Sarah Juliet Lauro received her PhD from the University of California and is an associate professor at the University of Tampa in Florida. She's written or edited numerous academic works on slavery and resistance, including A Zombie Manifesto, The Transatlantic Zombie, Slavery, Rebellion, and Living Death, and her latest work, Kill the Overseer, The Gamification of Slave Resistance. Today, she will discuss her research topic here at Mount Vernon entitled Monumental, Commemorations of Enslaved Resistance. So please join me in a warm Mount Vernon welcome for Sarah Juliet Lauro.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. How's the echo? Is it all right? The audio is okay for you? Great. So thank you so much for that introduction. I wanted to start by thanking some people, but I found that this was going to take up a good 15 minutes of my presentation. I have accumulated a long list of persons' names for my book acknowledgements, and I will be adding Maureen and Hutch and Kat to this list, and I'm sure others before my time here is done. I'm very fearful of leaving anyone out, so I thought instead of reading the list, I would just leave this slide up here for a moment. And let me just say that this has been such an invaluable experience. I've said to so many people that I don't know how anyone manages to write anything without a fellowship of this kind. To have the time and space to dedicate myself entirely to writing and research has really kept me on pace for the book that I'm working on, which is under deadline. So let me tell you a bit about that project. Monumental, Commemorations of Enslaved Resistance is under contract with the University of Minnesota Press, and the entire book manuscript is due in June 2025. I expect that if all goes to plan, it should be published in early 2026. I want to start by saying that I'm not a historian. Well, maybe I'm trying to be a cultural historian, but my training is in literary studies. I've written books on the myth of the zombie and on video games, which we can set aside for the moment. The point is, I may look at things a little differently from many of my peers here. And one place that this becomes apparent is in my attention, not to what we know, but to what we don't know, and even to celebrating that which we don't know. I understand that might seem a bit strange at the start of this presentation, but we'll come back to it at the end. So here's what we're going to do in the next 40 minutes or so. We're going to begin a bit unusually with a thought experiment. And I'll present what is really the overall thesis of my book, which you can just associate with this keyword, opacity. Then I'll tell you a bit more about the project overall, giving you a picture of the chapters and the book's layout. My slides are a bit text heavy, so don't feel like you need to read what's on the slide. If anything's really important, I'll be reading it out loud. Then I'm going to drill down into the chapter that discusses museums, which is chapter 1, because that's really where Mount Vernon is going to come into play. Not to drag anyone else, but in that part of the talk, I'm going to give an overview of what many museums do wrong when they attempt to highlight enslaved persons. Next, I'll present you with a kind of scorecard we can use to evaluate the representation of enslaved persons in museums and commemorative spaces. Then I'll discuss, how does Mount Vernon rate? Spoiler alert, they do quite well. And I'll give quite a few examples from the museum, the mansion, the tours I've taken here, but I'll also suggest some places where a few slight changes might be made. And then I'll be happy for us to have more of a discussion. because much of this is newly drafted material and I welcome your feedback. So if that sounds good, I hope you'll indulge me in this slightly strange beginning to the thought experiment. This is kind of going to be intense, so just bear with me. My guess is that everyone here, if you turned up for this talk and you're living in this time and place, that you know why we need to care about slavery and the enslaved people who worked and lived at Mount Vernon. So I'm going to start with a thought experiment that takes us to a very different place. I want you to imagine, really imagine, close your eyes if it helps, that you've just been told by the powers that be that a foreign nation is about to rain bombs all over Mount Vernon, or wherever you happen to be if you're streaming this. And I want you to imagine, which may not be that realistic, that there's really nowhere safe for you to go. No shelter that you're told is going to be safe. No way emergency services are really going to be able to respond to a crisis of this magnitude. And you've got an hour to figure out where you're going and what you would take. I'm not asking, what do you do? I'm asking, how do you feel? And that's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer it. Why am I asking? Well, I'm asking because it is a reality for some of our fellows currently residing on this planet, and because this meditation allows us to get right to the heart of my book really quickly. What I'm trying to ascertain with this project, the bigger question at stake, is how can we feel empathy for someone very different from us without imagining ourselves in their place? I'm going to say that again in slightly different words because it's so important. How can we feel empathy for someone with a different lived experience without imagining how we would feel if it were us? What we just did is not that, right? We imagined how we would feel if we were in a precarious, critical situation in a war zone. It's one that real people are suffering through, and we should care about them. My question is, could I get you to feel the same level of compassion for those people in a different way without asking you to step into their shoes? And here's why I'm asking. What we often see in commemorations of slavery is that museums take what I'm going to call this shortcut to empathy. And I think it's important that in the case of enslaved persons, especially for reasons that will become clear during this presentation, we should take our time and take the long way around. I begin with this thought experiment somewhat ironically, because I've just asked you to do something that I think doesn't work well in commemorations of enslaved persons, and especially in commemorating resistance to enslavement. I've engineered an exercise here that's interactive, though I didn't make you answer out loud, and that asks you to put yourself in the place of the victim to cultivate empathy. We'll now see why these aren't useful strategies when the task at hand is commemoration of enslaved people. So here's one shortcut to empathy that I've seen at probably a dozen museums devoted to slavery around the world. I shorthand it with the phrase, "Feel the weight of these chains." In this kind of display, museum goers are asked to interact with the kind of chains that would have bound enslaved persons. And the thinking goes that this kind of experience cultivates empathy. I mean, what's wrong with that? Empathy is good. Now, I'll be honest, just on a gut level, I was skeptical of this kind of display. I found it cringy, as the Gen Z kids say. And I think for me, it was that the optics were fairly problematic, as the millennials say. When we are talking about people who were enslaved, we're considering those whose autonomy was erased, whose labor was appropriated, who were denied basic rights, like deciding where to live, how to work, even in many cases with whom to have children. The idea that you could offer museum patrons the experience of stepping into the enslaved body as if it were a pair of pants by replicating a tactile experience like feeling the weight of these chains, and that only for a few seconds when real persons were bound with chains like these for days or weeks or months on end, just rubbed me the wrong way. And then I started doing research. And here I rely on the work of social scientists who have done actual data collection on human subjects, something that I am not trained to do. In the 1990s, there was a trend called disability simulation that spread across schools and across college campuses. I remember one being organized at Clemson University as late as 2016. The impulse behind them was good. The conductors of these exercises wanted to raise awareness and cultivate empathy for the disabled by having non-disabled persons use earplugs to experience hearing impairedness, wear dark shades to experience blindness, and even use wheelchairs for a day in paralysis simulations. But recent research has shown that these simulations actually had the exact opposite effect of what was intended. And I'm quoting a bit here. Although people reported that they felt more empathy as the result of participating in these simulations, when this was tested, it was found that they may actually make the situation worse by encouraging participants to feel that they had experienced another's identity and could lay claim to understanding the condition of a differently embodied person. End quote. So the ins and outs of exactly how they tested this is beyond the scope of this presentation, but I would encourage anyone interested to check out the references that I'm drawing here, and I could supply others. To really bastardize the concept, then, we might think this goes something like, oh yeah, I was blind for an hour once. It wasn't that bad. But on a deeper level, I think the problem is just with the idea that you can come to know what someone else has experienced through a temporary simulation. Now, I am not the first to question how empathy should be employed when we talk about slavery. In her landmark text, which is a must cite for any literary scholar who works on slavery, Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, she looks even at the way that abolitionist texts mobilized a similar kind of participatory empathy by asking the audience to imagine themselves in the place of the enslaved. This is a really key text, so I'll leave this slide up, but I'm just going to emphasize this one line that's highlighted. In making the slave suffering his own, John Rankin begins to feel for himself rather than for those whom this exercise in imagination presumably is designed to reach, end quote. I think of the image of an eclipse in making sense of this. When you feel empathy by making it about yourself, how would you feel if your children were torn away from you at the auction block? How would you feel if your belly was still hungry after your meager ration of meal and fish? How would you feel to be awakened with your muscles aching and have to go back into the fields after only a few hours rest? How would you feel if your wife was raped by the master and you couldn't do anything about it? You cease to be thinking about the other person. And though we might just have this problem with empathy across the board, I think it's especially unproductive when we're trying to talk about enslaved persons or others, victims of genocide, refugees, who essentially are treated this way because their personhood has been erased in the first place. So I return to the question we asked with our thought experiment. Is there any other way? Well, disability advocates who have studied those simulations say there is. The trick is, and here I'm quoting, to imagine how someone else feels instead of imagining how you yourself would feel. They found this actually produced more empathy, not less. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., by the way, does an amazing job of this. It doesn't ask you to think about yourself, it just shows you what happened. But here's the next level of complexity to my argument. And here we can turn to that key word I mentioned earlier, opacity. I'm drawing from various philosophers and thinkers, especially anti-colonial thinkers like Edward Glissant, Frantz Fanon, and Achille Mbembe. And though I don't want to get too bogged down in the theory here, I think the application of Glissant's concept of the right to opacity deserves at least a moment or two. In Poetics of Relation, Glissant talks about the project of knowing, which obviously included study, categorization, imposing hierarchies. All of this was a project that he calls the West, but which we could think of as the part of Enlightenment rationality that was looking to justify enslavement and later colonization. He writes of the transparency demanded by those systems of knowledge and of the power to be found in combating transparency. And this is a quote. I thus am able to conceive of the opacity of the other for me without reproach for my opacity for him. To feel in solidarity with him or to build with him or to like what he does, it is not necessary for me to grasp him. It is not necessary to try to become the other, to become other, nor to make him in my image, end quote. So here's my takeaway. When commemorations employ devices of opacity to subtly remind the beholder that they themselves are not the person whose condition they are considering, effectively blocking identification with the historical person, the empathy that is fostered stays on the right track. When opacity is introduced, it's less likely, though of course not impossible, that the person thinks, how would I feel? And more likely that, with a reminder that this is a unique situation they do not share, that the empathy they feel can be of that other purer variety. Now, opacity might seem a strange choice when we're talking about slavery, and that has to do with archive trouble. As I'm sure everyone here knows, but it bears repeating, as students of the history of slavery, we are reliant on an archive that was predominantly written by the enslavers. And that, at its genesis, as so many scholars point out, Saidiya Hartman, Marisa Fuentes, Jennifer Morgan, Caitlin Rosenthal, is about the transformation of persons into objects in the accounting ledgers and ship's logs where human beings are first translated into mere numbers. So we have this archive that is already opaque when it comes to enslaved persons. And here I'll give an illustration pulled from the holdings of Mount Vernon. One of the many rare documents that I looked at while here is an overseer's journal. For pages on pages, the author chronicles the weather and what he does around the plantation, and he shares with the reader his own family drama and his squabbles with other people, and he tracks laboriously the visitors to Mount Vernon's comings and goings. The only time that enslaved persons are mentioned is if there's a problem where they leave the grounds, like so-and-so was sent to town for whatever, or if someone missed work because they were ill. But by and large, with the exception of slave narratives that were produced by abolitionists like those of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Olaudah Equiano, Solomon Northup, etc., we don't have access to the kind of day-to-day records from the perspective of enslaved persons. So when it comes to wanting to commemorate enslaved people, we may think that the best way to do that, since the archive is inherently silent or even opaque on this score, is to combat opacity in our commemorations. And that's arguably what Mount Vernon and other historical sites have been trying to do by making visible the enslaved persons who worked here. And that's a great thing, entirely laudable. Yet by and large, to look at the archive is to be confronted with the cruelty of the banal. How many shirts were made this week? Why so few? How many persons called out sick? Why so many? There are then numerous reasons why opacity serves us well when we are commemorating resistance to enslavement. For one thing, I think it prevents that slippage I've discussed from empathy into occupation. But another reason is that the goal of resistors was to escape the archive. Whether that means in terms of small-scale resistance, hoping it wouldn't be noticed that they took meat out of the smokehouse or broke a tool purposefully, or even hoping to escape the ledger altogether by leaving and finding one's freedom elsewhere, as did Ona Judge, Hercules Posey, and many others. Some names up here are Marcus, Neptune, Cupid, Paros, and Jack. So the question is twofold. How can museums thread that needle in terms of making visible the lives of historical enslaved persons without offering them up as avatars for experiential empathy? And when addressing resistance specifically, how can we pay homage to the resistors' attempt to escape either detection or apprehension by preserving some opacity around them in our commemorations? These are big questions, not easily answered, but to be wrestled with. To provide another example from the research that I've done at Mount Vernon, one of the letters that I was looking at in the archives is a fascinating item. Though it isn't a document to or from Washington directly, it comes from his relatives. This is a letter sent by Sarah Blackburn Crawford, the sister of Julia Blackburn, who would marry Bushrod Washington and eventually live at Mount Vernon, to her mother, Mrs. Christian Scott Blackburn. And here's a transcription, which I did with the help of Carolyn Sharp. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize the letter here. This is a mysterious document. It suggests that an enslaved person named Frank had been confined in punishment for some unspecified infraction that isn't described here. Though mention is made of another unopened letter to her brother where that is detailed. Sarah Blackburn describes being awakened by Frank's escape from his confinement and his subsequent elopement. She also mentions the escape of another enslaved person, Bill, from the rice fields, and blames one of their mothers for putting them up to it. And Blackburn advocates that her parents, who must still own the mother, should punish this woman. Here's the part that's highlighted on the slide. I hope my dear Papa and Mama will not let her get off clear this time, as I believe she has a desire to ruin us if she possibly can. In this short letter, then, there is a story of families divided, of persons as inherited property, of acts of resistance and retribution for those acts of escape. Now, my impulse as a scholar was to try to find more pieces of the puzzle. Where was that other letter that would tell us why Frank was locked up? Who is the enslaved woman who put them up to it? What happened to her? If Mr. Crawford would spare no expense to have Frank and Bill returned, surely he put out ads and offered rewards. Despite searching for hours on various databases and in diverse historical newspapers, I could find no further word of these freedom seekers. Neither man is listed in the wills left behind by Sarah or Nathaniel Crawford, so my hope is that they made it to freedom, but of course, there may be myriad reasons for this. The point I want to make is that rather than feeling frustration that I'm unable to locate the freedom seekers in any kind of archive, I can understand this absence in the record as a kind of symbolic fugitivity. Whether or not they successfully escaped their enslavement, they seem to have escaped the archive. Now, it feels a little late for this, to be honest, because we've already started diving into chapter 1, which is on museums, but I did just want to sketch out the book for you quickly. The introduction will trace out the theory of opacity and its application. The first chapter is on museums with a special emphasis, not just on participatory empathy, but also on interactive displays, to which we're going to discuss next. The second chapter is on literature, and it focuses especially on the trope of the unreliable narrator as a device of opacity. The third, on film, focuses on mistranslation. The fourth, on art, is about obstruction. And then there is an epilogue on counter monuments. So just to give you an example of how opacity works in other types of commemoration, you might have a film where action is left off screen so that the viewer doesn't get to see it. Or you may have passages of a language spoken that are unsubtitled, even in the closed captioning. This affects what I call a productive blockage that prevents the viewer from becoming fully absorbed in the narrative as an entertainment commodity. They may feel a kind of tension between their desire to know or see and the story that is being withheld from them. And this gap between themselves and the historical person being represented on the canvas, on the screen, the page, or in the museum display protects that history from being... I'm not going to finish that sentence just yet. In writing this, I really struggled to come up with the right word there. I rely a lot on bell Hooks's essay, Eating the Other. So I thought it protects that history from being consumed, digested, before settling on this. These moments of opacity protect that history from being fully incorporated, but I am open to suggestions. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more about chapter 1, which is on museums. I actually have to start talking about museums in a strange place by looping us back around to video games. In my forerunner that I published in 2020, Kill the Overseer, the gamification of slave resistance, I talked about various games, some mainstream console video games like the Assassin's Creed series, educational games aimed at children and played in schools, and also what belongs to a genre called serious games that we might think of almost like playable art pieces. The games I looked at all had something in common. They made the liberation of enslaved persons the object of the game. And one of the aspects of the games that really bothered me was when they were trying to approximate slavery in the form of the game, as if a child who spends 5 minutes clicking on digital images of cotton plants and feeling tired from that is going to now understand slavery. At the same time, I was just really disturbed by the optics of the fact that in these games, you're inhabiting an enslaved person and controlling them by means of the computer. This is one of the games I discussed in that book, and in fairness to them, it appears they are revamping the game now. But when I started working on this project, I realized that the same thing was happening in museums, sometimes in digital form and sometimes in analog form. And here I'm going to go into a bit of a show and tell, and the slides are going to go by fast and furious. So just get what you get and leave the rest. We've already discussed feel the weight of these chains, but I wanted to let you know that this is really so common that I've stopped photographing it. Here are a few more examples of places I've seen it in museums. Sometimes interactivity is low tech, as by creating a museum space that evokes the hold of a slave ship or one of the slave fortresses. In some places, one is invited to get into the same position as an enslaved person to see how they feel, such as in the cramped spaces in houses on the Underground Railroad, though there it may seem more natural as this is a real location. But consider this ill-conceived public monument in Richmond, Virginia, commemorating Henry Box Brown, who mailed himself to freedom, where the beholder is clearly invited to climb into the box. The other kinds of displays that I want to draw your attention to are those that invite participatory empathy, like this one, a physical hands-on experience at the Liverpool Slavery Museum that operates much like the video games I studied. You might notice this language right here, you are a slave. It uses the second person to ask the beholder to interact with the simulation as if they are an enslaved person, and then to make choices and lift the corresponding flaps to see what the result of their choice has been. I'm going to skip over a little bit. Interactives are digital displays that offer the museum patron a chance to get more information on a given topic. A low interactive display might just involve pushing a button to start a video, or even selecting from a range of topics to choose which one you might like to learn more about. They are enormously popular at museums, and I don't want to suggest here that there's anything inherently wrong with interactive displays. I saw them at every museum I visited this month, including the Harper's Ferry John Brown Museum, a very, very minimal one at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and quite a few at the National Museum for African American History and Culture, or NMIC, at least one of which, to my mind, is sort of problematic. Neither of these examples is terrible. The one on the left is a benign digital display, just bringing up more information about the life of Haitian Revolution leader Toussaint Louverture, among other freedom fighters. On the right is a display that offers more information about colonial slavery and timelines of resistance. But it can seem indelicate when such displays put the museum patron in a position where they can control enslaved persons with their fingertip. Interactives sometimes ask us to put ourselves in the place of historical figures to role play. And when we are talking about persons who were denied agency in their own lives, or when they, I messed up a line here. Or when these devices put us in control of enslaved persons, this just, to me, strikes the wrong chord. I'll let you linger a moment on this slide, the Civil Rights Lunch Counter Sit-In Interactive at NMIC. A lot of my work, especially in the last chapter on counter monuments, looks to the ways that the Jewish Holocaust has been commemorated as a kind of cultural barometer for the work of redress that needs to be done regarding slavery. Can you imagine an interactive that would have patrons move household members to various concentration camps by dragging their finger across a touchpad? No. And importantly, the Holocaust Museum in DC, which I returned to last week just to make sure that I was still accurate about this, really limits the kind of activity that it offers its patrons. And even when it does create interactive displays, like one geared towards children, it is careful not to gamify the experience, nor does it ask the visitor to put themselves in the shoes of the Holocaust victim. That's my only point here. Let me end this section by contrasting these with an example of useful opacity in a museum. It's a display that, somewhat ironically, was so opaque that I missed it. And here I'm going to read directly a paragraph from my book chapter. Incorporating opacity in commemorations of enslaved resistance can take many forms, as we will see across the 4 chapters of this book in our discussion of literature, film, art, and monuments. However, here is an illustration of how commemorations can make use of opacity by incorporating digital resources into the Memorial Museum. In the exhibit London Sugar Slavery at the Museum of the Docklands, there is a large, prominent table around which MP Thomas Fowle Buxton purportedly led discussions of the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. That's the picture up there on the left. Because I am genuinely uninterested in the ways that memorial museums heroize white abolitionists, I snapped this photo and hurried on. Had I lingered, I would perhaps have seen that every 15 minutes, this space is darkened and a 3-minute video plays over the table and nearby scrims. According to Ana Lucia Araujo's description of this display, its projection evokes Tacky's Revolt, the Berbice Rebellion, and it also quotes a letter from an escaped enslaved man, Ignatius Sancho, to Lawrence Sterne on the ills of slavery. A generous reading might hazard that the acts of self-emancipation referenced here are causally linked to Buxton's Abolitionist Act, redirecting credit for abolition from the white men who signed it into law back to the people who risked their own lives freeing themselves. That's the end of that passage. But you might be asking, well, what does opacity accomplish in this form if some people are going to miss the message? Well, my answer is that it pays homage to the difficult nature of enslaved resistance, of having to go undetected by some and become visible to others who could and would help. By only being selectively available, I think such displays resist or at least problematize what Achille Mbembe calls the musealization or museumification of the enslaved person, particularly where that could otherwise involve a kind of enjoyment or commodification of the enslaved person's story. So here's my informal scorecard for how I evaluate museums' commemorations of enslaved resistance, and this goes from worst to best. I rank low those experiences that offer commodification and appropriation, where there's a sense that the subject can be available for the beholder's enjoyment, where there are invitations to perform or play as the enslaved. Next, there's more of a range. Interactivity exists on a spectrum, so we need to ask what kind of interactive experience is fostered. Is commemoration merely happening in mimetic spaces, or are there digital displays that put this history in the control of the visitor? Are there empathy exercises where one takes the place of the historical enslaved person? Better is visibility without participation, or presence without apprehension. And I rank most highly those displays that incorporate devices of opacity, which can include spaces that encourage silent reflection, hidden aspects, things that are only selectively available, where there may even be misdirection or where some information is purposefully left out. One thing I haven't quite worked out is where spectating reenactments may fit in on this scorecard. But by making the subject available to the viewer for an interactive exercise, they are explicitly non-opaque. The big challenge is how to make visible the lives of enslaved persons without rendering them up for symbolic appropriation, occupation, or even apprehension. And I want to emphasize that this task is most critical when we are commemorating enslaved resistance. Let's turn to Mount Vernon and see how it stacks up by this metric. In every room of the Mount Vernon mansion, the tour guides emphasize which enslaved persons would have attended the Washingtons in that space. We hear about enslaved butler Frank Lee, Caroline Branham, Molly, Sal, Christopher Shields, Hercules, Doll, and Lucy. From my experiences here, I glean that it would be impossible to tour Mount Vernon and remain unaware that the Washingtons' wealth and lifestyle depended upon their enslavement of others. On most of the placards placed around the grounds, too, enslaved people are mentioned for the kind of work they would have performed there. Many of these placards also commemorate persons by name, like Peter Hardiman, who was not owned but leased by Washington from another slaveholder, William Lee, Nat and George, enslaved blacksmiths, Dulcie and Vina, 2 enslaved laundresses, and so forth. Therefore, Mount Vernon earns top marks for visibility. The hardships and abuses of the enslaved are made plain, as when in the women's barracks, the account of a spinner called Charlotte who was beaten by the overseer is related. And that's written on the plaque on the far left there. On the enslaved persons tour, guides often go into further detail about this event and the Washingtons' disappointing reaction to it. And they cover other examples of the Washingtons' mistreatment of the enslaved, that these human beings are named in Mount Vernon's commemorations and details of their lives presented, both on the enslaved persons specialty tour, but even in the regular mansion tour, is an invaluable service that the estate provides to its visitors. As my second tour guide, Austin Lipscomb, said, nothing here is unrelated to enslavement. The wreath-laying cemetery at the Slave Memorial is a poignant and powerful aspect of Mount Vernon's commemoration of the enslaved. It provides an opportunity for meditation, prayer, and reflection that respectfully honors the many buried here while preserving their opacity. To my mind, it strikes a perfect balance between making the enslaved visible without putting them on display. I think that the way this space is addressed can serve as a model to others. Whereas the archaeologist's efforts is ongoing, it is repeatedly emphasized in the literature that no remains will ever be disturbed. Here I could understand the impulse to use DNA evidence so that we might tell visitors exactly who is buried where. And although the website currently states, quote, the primary goal of this project is to create a map that shows exactly where individuals are interned on the ridge just southwest of Washington's tomb, the goal of this mapping project is merely to show where bodies are buried, but not to specifically identify who those persons are. It seems to me that since so much of the plantation's organization was built around the rigid control of space for the sake of surveillance, leaving final resting places opaque is a significant gesture. Let's look at a very different part of Mount Vernon's public display. There are several interactives in the museum related to the harpsichord, the material items in the collection, the paintings, and on the preservation and timeline of development of the museum itself. But one interactive display provides biographies of 17 of the Washington's enslaved servants. This interactive provides information on various enslaved persons who absconded from the plantation: Caesar, Priscilla, Hercules, Jack, and of course, Ona Judge. And while this is an efficient way to allow the interested visitor to quickly gain access to more detail about these people, I want to provide an illustration here of an opportunity to build a bit more opacity into this display. I want to suggest firstly that a bit of opacity could be created by denying the viewer the choice of which profile they want to interact with. As it is now, one can choose the person, but the digital form is unique in that it allows us to withhold certain powers from the interlocutor. It could be interesting to build a system that would randomly select, choosing for the viewer the enslaved person whom they could learn more about, or even by refusing to divulge some details. This would minimize the sense that the museum patron is in control over this history and safeguard the historical person from apprehension. Here's a really concrete, easy way this could be accomplished. On Hercules Posey's profile in this digital display, a second page is provided that lists the freedom seeker's address in New York, where it is believed he eventually lived out his days as a free person. If his precise location was redacted from the screen, as with a black bar obscuring the address, it would impart a sense that his privacy was being maintained within the commemoration of his escape. While we're on the subject of Mr. Posey, I want to note an interesting example of incidental opacity. In the greenhouse display devoted to the enslaved's quarters, this portrait is reproduced, labeled as Portrait of George Washington's Cook. In fact, as is documented on the Mount Vernon website and in an article called Mistaken Identity written by Jesse McLeod, this painting has been studied by art historians, and it has been determined that this is not Hercules, that the man portrayed therein is likely not even a cook. I have heard that Mount Vernon plans to update this display, and I understand that impulse, but I want to suggest that leaving the display up as is counts for me as an example of misdirection, one of the devices of opacity that I discuss in the book. It's particularly striking here because of the precision with which the archaeological artifacts in the same display case are cataloged. Because misdirection was a tool employed in resistance to enslavement, this incorrectly labeled image ironically pays homage to the strategies employed by freedom seekers. Misdirection, for example, was used by Ona Judge when, as a fugitive located in New Hampshire, she pretended to Washington's intermediary, Mr. Joseph Whipple, that she would meet him at the docks to set sail with him and return to Mount Vernon. She did not keep that appointment, but disappeared again into Portsmouth, thus ensuring her newly won freedom was not stripped of her. I know it probably goes against every rule in the museum curator's handbook, but leaving something incorrectly labeled or just unlabeled can serve as a nod to the subversive acts that were a part of enslaved resistance. And this isn't the first time that an instance of misdirection occurred in an exhibit on slavery. I don't really have time to talk about this, but I'd be happy to circle back to it in the Q&A if you're interested. Ona Judge, later Ona Judge Staines, is perhaps Mount Vernon's most famous freedom fighter. Even before visitors arrive at the estate, they may pass the historical marker erected on Mount Vernon Memorial Highway that commemorates her life and flight from bondage. She's memorialized at various places at Mount Vernon, including in one of the biographies that is read at the wreath-laying ceremony at the enslaved graveyard. She is given a prime role in the enslaved persons tour and prominently featured on the wall of the museum. The choice to use the design of the silhouette prevalent in this display and in the Lives Bound Together book published in conjunction with the exhibit, which seems to me to nod at opacity, is something I plan to continue researching to discuss further in the book. I'm not entirely convinced, however, that the person of Ona Judge should be one of those offered up for consumption through the reenactments. Despite the high-quality performance I attended by Timbala Cabre, this interactive impersonation symbolically returns Judge to the plantation from which she fled in life. She escaped from Philadelphia in May of 1796, but here she finds reincarnation in the plantation space, even though the decision of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was to represent Mount Vernon as it was in 1799, 3 years after Ona Judge took her freedom. I had written a different ending here, but then I went back to the estate and took the enslaved persons tour for the third time. On that tour, I witnessed a moment that gave me pause, that made me wonder if I'm being too hard on the interactive moments of commemoration. As the group was led by Annette Ahrens around the side of the greenhouse and slave quarters, we were told of the building's reconstruction from repurposed bricks, some of them from the White House, and of enslaved persons who would have originally made the bricks by hand. Ahrens pointed out a brick that still bears what appear to be fingerprints, and several of the visitors lined up to share a moment with the object, to put their hand in the indentations. One woman encouraged her son to do likewise. "Go ahead, son. This is history. This is our history." And with his permission, I snapped this photo. I was reminded of a scene from Jonathan Demme's adaptation of Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, which is itself a retelling of an act of enslaved resistance, the infanticide committed by Margaret Garner in 1856 when she killed her children rather than let them be recaptured into slavery. In what I think is the best scene of Demme's film, we see an eyeline match between two characters that exist in different timelines, as if the ancestors who have passed on and the present-day descendants are making eye contact across the expanse of time. So I want to temper myself here now. I don't mean to imply that all interactivity in commemoration is bad, because surely in its best moments, like the fingerprints in the brick, it can allow for a feeling of connection with the past. In conclusion, I think we need to always be mindful of how enslaved persons are put in display within the commemorative space of the museum. And we need to consider to whom this catharsis is offered. It's important to highlight opacity where it exists. For example, we don't know whose fingerprints those are. Rather than trying to fill the silences in the archive, we should let the silences speak in their own indecipherable language. We need to ask ourselves, does the representation of enslaved persons in plantation museums continue tethering them to this space? Does it render them objects of consumption? How can we find a balance that honors the enslaved without defying their desire to be free of this place or just to rest? I propose that opacity, when seeded into commemorative works, provides us an opportunity. Within the opacity, we acknowledge that full comprehension of the people we seek to honor and all that they suffered and enjoyed, loved and lost, will forever remain beyond our grasp. Thank you. We have time for questions. Yeah, Jill. Oh, no, I mean, that's okay. Go for it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sarah. That was fascinating to hear more about the book as a whole and some of these case studies, and of course, your thoughts on what's happening here. So, one question I have is with the Hercules Posey example.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you think I mean, I understand the argument you're making about opacity there, and kind of withholding the result of his escape or something, and letting his opacity in the period that we're interpreting here continue, maybe.
Right.
But I wonder, maybe more writ large, like what the value of an institution like ours, what value is there in withholding primary source documents from a visitor in the information that we've uncovered, that is tangible in the archive versus like creating something
Right.
that chips away at that opacity.
Yeah. I mean, I think we know he didn't want to be found in his time. I mean, the difference for Ona Judge, right, is that she had an opportunity and she gave interviews and she divulged some details about how she escaped, what her life was like here. But I think that speaking for these historical persons when we don't know what their wishes would have been, yeah, I think it can be, I mean, it's obviously a really hard question, but I think the bigger picture really goes back to that Edward Glissant I referenced, and all of these efforts to decolonialize the museum, to think about how museum spaces were integrally tied to this project of the Enlightenment and the need to know, and sort of figure out where can we challenge ourselves to not know, to accept not knowing. And I think that would be one example. And it's not like that information shouldn't be shared with Hercules Posey's descendants. It's just that maybe sending a signal to the museum visitor that we know it, we're not sharing it. I think that's where redaction can be so important.
I really like the way you just put that about, the need to know driving these modern museums, and pushing back against that kind of core value. But my other question is about museums as well. And I'm coming from an art museum background, so I was especially thinking about moments in art museums where slavery is even brought up, which is sort of a recent turn.
Right, yeah.
And, especially in a historic gallery, so art that's made in the 18th and 19th centuries that is, let's say, made by an enslaved artist or a craftsperson. Those objects are, by and large, nothing but opacity. And the trace of the maker is often so minimal.
Yeah.
There's no signature. So the gallery itself is sort of very opaque to a visitor, and it requires some level of explanation and a label to even tell you that you're looking at the work of an enslaved maker.
Right.
I'm just wondering, like, how an example of that sort falls into your kind of concept here, and like, is a label explaining what we know, even minimal as it is, kind of a nice comp to that opaque object? Or what's our ethical um, push what's our responsibility to this opaque object when its maker has been erased,
Right.
and we're trying to salvage something of who they were.
I mean, I think in that case, you can presume the maker wanted their work shown. I think that, when you make a work of art, unless it's a personal diary or something like that.
Well, often in our museum context, it's usually like ceramics that are unsigned.
Oh, I see.
Or silver.
Right.
Or maybe we're thinking about the work of someone who worked in a painter's workshop,
Okay.
who didn't make the art themselves, but their labor is on view in that painting.
I really, the next chapter I'm going to write is the chapter on art. And I'll be honest, the chapter on museums is really on historical museums. And then the chapter on art is really going to be more focused on 20th century artists looking back at slavery and inculcating opacity into their work. So, but I will definitely bear that in mind as I'm writing that chapter, and I'll probably be in contact by email. But yeah, thanks for raising the question. It's a really good one.
A more general question,
Sure.
overarching what you've been talking about.
Okay.
In your mind, what should a museum be doing or an exhibit be doing to a visitor?
Right.
Should it be imparting empathy? Should it be imparting information? Should it be imparting a sense of the experience? Because unless you deal with the goal of the museum or the exhibit, these other things are flexible.
Right.
So in your mind, what should a museum be doing, particularly in regards to enslavement and the enslaved?
Right. Thank you for the question, because I think it allows me an opportunity to kind of draw two different paths. I mean, these are really different things when you're commemorating slavery and when you're commemorating resistance. And so we could take the example of the Holocaust Museum, for example. Although I said there's no invitation to participate, they're not withholding any information. What they are withholding is control of the viewer. So there was this one moment I was looking at a map, and the map showed all of the different concentration camps. Obviously, it wouldn't be useful if that map had opacity in it, right? We want people to see the grand scale of the Holocaust and the atrocity that was perpetrated. But what I'm seeing in terms of some displays of slavery is that this impulse to make things interactive, because a lot of people appreciate it, it makes it more fun, is to put the viewer in direct tactile contact with that, so that they could, even just zooming in, clicking on the concentration camp, seeing data. I think obviously the Holocaust Museum was very thoughtful. They do have an interactive. It is a minimal interactive that really almost challenges you to rethink what an interactive is or should be. They've made the decision not to put that in the hands of the viewer. So I think in terms of slavery in general, but especially when we're commemorating resistance where people didn't want to be found, I think that's where I think the opacity is so important. So thank you for letting me sort of underline that point.
Thank you so much, SJ. I, of course, have 100,000 questions and comments, which will happen over dinner tonight. But I was hoping to hear a little more from you, for all of us, about this concept of the museumification of enslaved people.
Yeah.
One, and two, if you see a difference in would you recommend a difference in how museums explore the lives of enslaved people versus the institution of slavery?
Yeah, so that's not my work, but I was going to propose to Mathieu that we should actually translate an article together, because there's an article by Achille Membe, I think it's called Anti-Museum, and it really argues, it takes a very bold claim that no slave should ever be put in a museum. That's its claim, that to put a slave in the museum is to tether them to a space, it's to make them continue to labor after death. And I mean, it really blew my mind. So it's informing my thought process, but I'm not taking it that far. I'm just trying to draw from that when I think about, well, how could we maybe take some of the spirit of this and use opacity to kind of do a kind of half measure. Does that answer that question? I mean, I'll give you the article. It's not very long, but it is only in French. But it is something I think everyone would cite in this field if it could be translated into English.
Do you have any thoughts on the difference between exhibiting and interpreting the lives of
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question because I think it gets to the historical reenacting piece that I haven't wrapped my head around. Can you say it a different way? Because I want to make sure I understand. You mean presenting information? Yeah. Mhm. Right. Yep. That's true.
laws.
Yep.
You know, there's just so much kind of a grander scale in a way.
Right.
And not to say that that exploration is more important, but simply that it's different. Of course, it incorporates elements of exploring enslaved people's lives. But it does seem to me an opportunity to explore opacity in the larger scheme of what the institution of slavery was and did in early America.
Right.
It just I mean, a thought for you to like, there is a way that historians distinguish between like the history of slavery and history of enslaved people.
Right. I mean, I think Achille Membe would be unconvinced by that, but I'll continue thinking about it.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Have you visited the Harriet Tubman Museum in Chesapeake?
No, I keep
I would
applying-
highly recommend it.
Yeah, I keep applying for funding to do a component of this that will be Underground Railroad related, but I have not. And this project really started with wanting to mainly commemorate violent revolt because I was very concerned about the fact that, you know, there aren't statues to, well, I was aware, let's say, that there aren't statues to Nat Turner. You know, there might be some historical markers, but there isn't the kind of celebration in the United States of violent acts of enslaved resistance as there are in the Caribbean. But I will make a point of getting to it. So the Harriet Tubman Museum.
Right. There are two. There's one from the early 20th century, and then there's one that the Park Service, the Virginia State Park Service built like a new building a couple of years ago.
Do you remember any instances of opacity or interactivity? Is there a reason why that one's coming to top of mind?
I would have to revisit it because it was a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago.
Right.
But as a author and a researcher, I would highly recommend it.
I mean,
it's not huge.
Yeah.
But it's worth a visit, and you can get some really good seafood
Okay.
in that area.
Great. I am kind of thinking of myself as just sort of like launching this idea with the expectation that other people who are interested in it will continue to think about opacity in different museum spaces, because I'm not going to be able to visit each and every one. But thank you very much for that point. I'll put it on my list.
So
Hey, Jocelyn.
hi, thank you. So I'm like struggling with this idea of opacity and thinking about how, when including descendant collaboration and participation in creation of museum activities or things like that, how does that, it often comes in conflict with opacity in this
Right.
idea. So how do we like navigate that and keep the privacy of the enslaved people while also respecting the descendants that might have personal inside knowledge of their wishes?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a great example is the graveyard, right? Because when I was talking to the archaeologists, they said, we're absolutely not going to do DNA testing unless we get every single descendant on board. And I think taking into consideration the descendants, but also almost thinking like maybe you have two different, not literally, but maybe you have two different museums, right? Maybe the descendants have access to things like I referenced with the Hercules Posey address. Not all this information maybe needs to be shared with everyone, but certainly I think The tricky thing here is you almost need to create a sieve where some people get access to the information and some people don't. But I'm really aware that that parallels the struggle of the enslaved person who had to decide, do I tell Tom that I'm planning to run this weekend? Can he be trusted? Is he going to go tell somebody else? Is he going to help me out? And so that decision of who gets to know and who doesn't get to know, I think can at least be gestured to, though the work of how you make that actually happen that's beyond my pay grade.
We've got time for one more.
Maureen?
Oh, thank you. I'm thinking about the opacity and transparency, and I'm thinking about not that many years ago, everything was so opaque
Yeah.
that people didn't even talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Now maybe you're saying we're going to too much transparency, but isn't that just the pendulum? And we're
Yes.
going to find out where the best is
That's
at some
right.
point soon?
Yeah, I think that this is the dialectic at work. We're going to end up more in the middle. I think that that's a really helpful way to think about it.
I was just going to follow up on what was said about descendants.
Mm-hmm.
We were at Monticello 2 weeks ago,
Okay.
and the Hemmings family is exceedingly involved
Yep.
in the storytelling
Mhm.
that is taking place currently.
Right.
And in fact, they have a room
Mm-hmm.
where the family has put a display of what has happened to what the story of some of the families was.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's it's their desire to
Yep.
be involved in telling the story.
Right.
It's not interactive. It's
Mhm.
all linear. You're reading it.
Yep.
You can decide what you want to read and what you can't. That's where you
Mhm.
have control as a viewer.
Right.
But it's there because the family itself
Mm-hmm.
feels that it needs to be there.
Right.
And I appreciated being able to read those stories, and I
Yes.
spent time in that room.
Mhm.
And I think there is space,
Right.
you know, that
I agree. I have no problem with that. The part I cut when I said I'm skipping over something now was actually a part about Monticello and visiting it in 2015, and they had an interactive display where kids could pretend to be enslaved, and I was very, very troubled by that. Yeah, I know. I'm in touch with them. They scrubbed it, and in fact, it's very hard to find evidence it ever existed. But yeah, so thank you for those comments, and thank you all for coming out and having your lunch here.
Thank you all for coming, and let's give a big round of applause.